Hello, this is Carl Irwin. We're going to look at a Blender tutorial here on creating assets that are two-dimensional that appear to be like a cyclone or a tornado. I have a few examples here to show you. The first one here is kind of a solid, puffy kind of structure. The second one here is really more typical to what you would see in photography, more of a misty, foggy version. This one's a little bit more wavy, kind of a wavy texture. This one's a little more wispy. It looks kind of thin. And then this last one here, of course, looks kind of like a fiery looking tornado or cyclone. Now these images are created using a two-dimensional process in which we mask and rather animate a single cloud texture. And that's a single frame, I should even say. It's just a single plane, image plane. And then we mask it. And then we layer the masks in such a way that it appears to be rotating. And then we take that two-dimensional composite composition and we add a mesh deform effect to it inside of the 3D viewport. And then with that, and also using various compositing techniques inside of the node settings for the material inside the viewport, we can get all of these different kinds of textures of this image, except for the fire one. The fire one requires one extra post-process compositing effect. But all these others we can create directly in the viewport with just a single image that we render out, one cloud texture, a seamless cloud texture. So let's jump into this tutorial and see how this is done. Okay, we'll try to do this as fast as possible. We are just going to make the asset for this project. We're not going to do any of the compositing for that storm scene that you saw at the beginning. I assume that you would understand how to composite a two-dimensional asset into a scene. If you are uncertain of how to use a two-dimensional asset that has alpha transparency in a scene, in the Blender viewport or using the compositor, I would invite you to look at my tutorial series Hacking the Viewport and look at the first few episodes of that series on my YouTube channel where I discuss using alpha transparency and the issues of draw order directly from the viewport to use the viewport as a 3D compositor. So very quickly we're going to get rid of the default cube and the light. We're going to go to the top view. So align view to, actually go here to the top view, and then we're going to align the camera to view. So we'll align the active camera to the view. We're going to select the camera and we're going to make it a square resolution. So we're going to set the bottom number here in our resolution to 1920 to match the top. We're going to leave it at 50%. It doesn't need to be any higher than that, although keep in mind that the higher the resolution, the better the final product. We're just going to kind of skimp on that a little bit so we can move a little bit quicker. We're going to create a plane, scale this up, and we want the plane to sit just outside of the bounds of the camera. We're going to add a texture to this plane, so we'll click on New. We want it to be a shadeless material. Under the texture slot we're going to add a cloud texture, and we're going to set the viewport shading to rendered. So it's actually rendering from the viewport using the Blender internal render engine. We're just going to do this one time for one frame. We just need to get a cloud texture made so that we can import it as an image plane later on in the project. Underneath the cloud settings, we're going to set the size to 0.2. We're going to change the coordinates to generated, so that will go over the UV mapping that hasn't been set on there yet. We're going to set the depth up to about 6, so we get a lot more detail in there. We're going to set it to the noise to hard. And then we're going to go to the colors, and we're going to turn on ramp. Now the black in the ramp by default has 0 alpha ability here. It's transparent, completely transparent. So we're going to move that up and turn it up all the way up. And we're going to flip the colors. So now we have kind of this white, wispy, smoky look to it. Now what we want to do is we're going to select the black side of our ramp, and we're going to move the position in a little bit, and we just want to move it in far enough so that we can see in our render output what would be approaching some absolute black, but not quite there. So slide it in just a little bit more. Easier if I just grab it. So we can kind of see a couple of spots here that indicate that we have kind of a wider dynamic range on this ramp. So we want absolute white, and we want a couple of specks of what looks like nearly absolute black. And that's it. What we're going to do is we're going to render this one frame. So we'll go to the render buttons. These are the internal render engine buttons. And we're going to click on the single frame render, let it render out. Of course, you could do this from cycles using the texture settings in there. It really does not matter. We just need this one image here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to save the image. I've actually already done this, but we'll do it again here. Go to the desktop. I have a tutorial here. I'll call this Clouds 2 because I've already saved a version of it. And save as. There we go. Now what we want to do is we want to open that image up inside of the UV image editor. Right now it's just showing the render result, so we'll click on the folder here, go back to where we saved it, and we'll select our image, Clouds 2. Now if we go here to the Image tab and I click on Edit Externally, by default Blender on a Ubuntu Linux system will open up GIMP if you have it installed. You can also set your image editor inside of the settings in Blender so that it will automatically transfer your image to that editor. So we opened it up in GIMP. What we need to do is make this seamless. So there is a filter that we can use. Under Filters tab, we'll come down to Map, and under Map we will select Make Seamless. So what this does is it recreates a border around our image that is now seamless, so that as you go to the edge of the top border here, it is then it's taken over by the bottom border. So these pixels that would come next logically are replicated down here, and now this has an infinite edge. So we can tile this as many times as we want, and this texture will continue. So what we'll do is we'll take this image, we're going to overwrite the original one, let that save. And once it is saved, we're going to use this image to animate. So we will discard the changes. We don't need that anymore. Go back to the 3D viewport. I'm going to get rid of our plane, so we'll delete it. And we're going to set this to texture, viewport shading. And we're going to open up also our shading settings here. And I'm going to set it from multi-texture to GLSL, so we're using the OpenGL capabilities from the viewport. We will now import, go to File, and go to Import, Image as Planes. And you may need to enable this. I'm not sure that it's enabled by default on your installation of Blender. You'll have to go to the add-ons and type in Images as Planes and then enable that add-on. We will click on that. We'll go to where we saved our plane, and we'll select the image that we made. We want to make sure that it is set to shadeless. We'll import that image. We'll scale it up. And we want it to be big enough to cover the complete area of the camera. Now what we'll do is we're going to add a modifier to this. We're going to add an array modifier. We're going to set this count to 3. Now you'll see what's happened here. This image is replicated over as a plane, and it is completely seamless. It's infinite. So once you get to the edge and it starts over again, it goes on and on and on. Now what we can do is we can make a short video texture that has this cloud texture moving on it. So I'm going to set a couple of keyframes here. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to duplicate this and set this to current scene. The duplicated one will turn off for a second. We'll go to the first one. We want it to go from left to right, because that's how a vortex would move, at least in the northern hemisphere. It would move, I believe it would move in this counterclockwise kind of motion. So we'll insert a location there, and then we'll go to the end of our 250 frames. We'll slide this over on the x-axis over to here, and we will insert another keyframe for a location. We're going to add a graph editor window here for a second, and what I want to do is we're going to right button click, or rather put the cursor onto the graph here and hit V, and we're going to select for the set keyframe handle type vector, and that will make it a straight curve so that there's no F curve involved here. You can just slide this down. We can still have the menu here for our graph editor. We might use that later. Now as I play this back, you'll see that our texture is moving through space quite nicely here. Let me turn on the other cloud texture, and on this cloud texture we're going to go to the object settings. We're going to turn it to X-ray so that it is sitting on top of the first texture, even though they occupy the same space. We're going to go to the material settings, and we're going to click on this number 2 so that the material is assigned only to this plane here, so it's just its own copy. Then we're going to make this one transparent. We're going to set the alpha to 0.6, so just a little bit better than half. So now we can see through it to the plane underneath. Now what we want to do is we're going to rotate this on the Z-axis. So we'll hit R for rotate, Z. We'll rotate it 180 degrees, so it's completely opposite the texture underneath. We're going to scale it up a little bit. Actually, we're going to scale it up quite a bit. And we're going to make another move here. We want this one also to move from left to right. So we'll slide it over, and I'm going to move this up. So we're getting kind of a different spot of it. And we'll insert a keyframe for location. We'll go to the end, and we'll slide this over not quite all the way to the end of it, and we'll insert another location keyframe. Now what we've made here is a parallax motion. One thing we want to do is we want to also make this a straight curve, so we'll go to the graph editor, hit V and select vector, and now it's a straight curve without an F curve in it. Now if we turn on the render only settings here for the display, we can see what this animation will look like. If we go back to the beginning and hit play, there's a parallax motion where some of the clouds, the top layer, is moving a little bit faster than the bottom layer, and it's all moving from left to right. Now what I would do is I would render this out using the OpenGL render buttons down here. I'd click on the animation one, and I'd render out this animation as an AVI JPEG sequence, and we'll go to our folder, and I would render it out as an animation. So this one here, cloud animation, I've already done it, so I'm not going to do it again, but I would render that out 250 frames, and then we can use this later on in the video sequence editor. So let's go to the video sequence editor. We've rendered this out already, and we'll open up a properties tab. I find that it's helpful to have a properties tab, and also to have the graph editor. That's very useful for animation. Go back to the beginning of our scene here, our timeline, and we're going to add a movie. We'll go to the where we saved that, and we would select on this one here, our cloud animation. We would add that strip, and what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into an infinite loop. Okay, so that it loops over and over and over again seamlessly. That way we can use this cloud animation and offset it in different ways as we go along through the process of making this texture. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate. Actually, let's do this a little differently. I'm going to take the animation and we're going to shorten it a little bit. We're going to, instead of have 250 frames, we're going to make this 200 frames. So if you remember from the last tutorial, the first part of this short series, I made a infinite loop by adding two fade effects right in the center, and we offset the original animation so that the beginning was in the center and the end was also from the center, and then we did a crossfade kind of trick. We're going to do something a little bit more simple. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the end of our 200 frames, at least 50 frames on the end, and we're going to move it over one more frame, and then I'm going to hit K to cut, use the knife tool there to cut our animation. We'll select this piece on the end, and we're going to move it over to the very beginning on the next channel. So now if you look at our animation, the last frame looks like it's one off from the first frame. So it loops around. Now what we need to do is we're going to keyframe the opacity on this top piece here. So on the very last frame, we're going to set the opacity to 0. Insert a keyframe, and then we're going to go back to frame number 10, and we'll set the opacity to 1. And we'll just leave the F curve in there. It doesn't have to be a straight point-to-point animation. Now what happens as we play this through, you'll see that there is a fade effect that is imperceivable, so that it looks like this cloud animation. You'll notice that when we get to the end of this last frame here, it will loop around seamlessly. So it's a perfect infinite loop, and we can use this now in our project. Now what I would do is just to kind of keep things moving quickly, rather than keep this effect in here and condense it down and use this further, I would just render this out. So I would render this out to our folder here, and I've already done it, but I would render it to this one, call it Cloud Animation Loop. And we would accept that and render that out. So we've already have it done, so I'm just going to get rid of this here, and we'll bring in our looped animation. It's this one right here, and you can see this is what it looks like. Now what we're going to do is we're going to mask this in such a way that it kind of resembles the general movement of clouds in a vortex. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to add to this an effect. We're going to add a transform effect, and on this transform effect, in fact what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom one here and just make it mute it. The transform effect, we're going to apply scale, a uniform scale, and also a rotation. So we're going to rotate this so that it's going at an upward angle left to right. Something else we might want to do on this while we're thinking about it is we'll add a curves adjustment. And we're just going to increase our, do it this way. We want to bring our blacks back in so we have that deep dynamic range that we started with. So we're just going to take the black edge and move it in to a point where we start to see a little bit of absolute black showing up in a couple of pixels. That's probably sufficient enough right there. Animate through this and see. So it might be a little too dark. Let's move it back a little bit. Alright, so there we go. Let's rotate this so it's at an upward angle. We'll call it, say 15 degrees is fine. And then we're going to scale it up so that it fills the frame out. One other thing you can do to make everything move quicker is set a proxy render size. So I set it like down to 25%. That makes everything move a little bit quicker. So we will increase the scale so that it fills the frame completely. So now we have this kind of an animation where this cloud texture is moving at an upward angle left to right. Okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to mask this out and give it an alpha transparent mask that's in the shape of a vortex. Now, if you have a very powerful system, you can just kind of layer up this effect, or what we're going to do is we're going to render a single frame, and then we're going to re-import that frame for the mask so that this doesn't drag down our system so much. We're going to add a color, and actually we'll just leave it there. We don't have to fill it out. We'll duplicate the color, move it up, and on the top one we'll make the top one white. I'll select both together, and then we'll add a wipe effect. On the wipe effect we're going to turn off the default fade, and we're going to bring our fade out here so we can see it. We're going to turn the angle to a negative number until we have kind of a upward slant going up towards the right. I'll move the fade over. So we want this fade to be off-center from the middle of the frame here. And I'll move the angle maybe down just a little bit. And then we're going to turn up the blur width a little bit, probably about to 0.2, maybe even a little less than that. We'll take that. What we're going to do with this then is we're going to condense this down. I'm going to make a metastrip out of it and duplicate it. Move this one on top. Now this top one, we're going to use the flip option here. We're going to flip it on the x-axis so it's going the other way. And I'm going to set the blend mode to multiply, so we end up with this kind of vortex looking piece here. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to render one frame of this. This is just going to save us a whole lot of time. We will save this image to our folder, and we'll call it Vortex Mask. Again, you could just layer these up if your system is quick enough, and we're just going to get rid of these two things there. Let's add our image that we made, Vortex Mask, and we'll make sure it fills the entire width here. We're going to make another copy of this that we will set aside because we're going to need it later on. Set it up there, and I'll kill the opacity on it. Now what we're going to do, we'll kill the opacity on this one too. We're going to take this and we're going to use it as a mask for the transform underneath this cloud texture that's been animated. So I will select the cloud texture at the very bottom. I'm going to create a mask modifier. And for that mask modifier, we're going to select Vortex Mask. First one. You see what it's done. And we're going to change this output to alpha over. We'll take all of this and we will condense it down to a meta strip. And for the meta strip, we'll change the blend mode to alpha over. And I'm going to move this up on the y-axis here to the next channel. Underneath, we'll add a color, black color, so we can see what's happening on top. Now what we'll do is we'll take this top strip and we're going to duplicate it, our meta strip. The bottom one down here we are going to flip. So if I'm going to turn off the opacity on the top one so we can see what's going on. We're going to take this bottom one and we're going to use the flip tool on the x-axis. So now if you look at the animation, it's going the opposite direction. Now we don't want this animation to be symmetrical to the top one. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it. Remember that this is a looped animation. So anywhere that we cut it, as long as we recut it back in the same place, it will loop around. We're going to split it here in the middle so it's offset. We'll just bring the ends in, bring it back to 1, just to keep our composition kind of clean here. I'm going to take both of these and we'll make those a meta strip. So now we have set this to alpha over. We have two animations that are going opposite directions and they're offset in terms of their textures. We're going to take the top one and we're going to move it over on the we're going to use the offset, image offset tool here. We're going to move it over on the x-axis about, let's say, 20 pixels. To the right, now go bigger than that. Let's make it about 50 pixels. Maybe even a little bit bigger. Let's go 100 pixels. And we'll take the other one and we'll go the opposite direction, negative 100 pixels. Now this is a little exaggerated. We might want to clean this up in a bit, but if you watch this as I pull through, you see that we get this parallax motion. So on the left we see some of this cloud texture coming towards the left, whereas on the right and on the face it's all going to the right. Let me bring this back in a little bit. We're going to go negative 50 just to tighten it down a little bit more. We really need to see a little bit of a margin of this on the one side, sort of 50. And as we scroll through, you can see what's going on here. So we've set up this parallax motion. Now, this looks kind of chintzy, but you can start to see the three-dimensionality of it in that it looks a little bit like this might be swirling. It looks pretty flat right now, but it looks like it could be swirling. We're going to then take our vortex mask that we had set aside up here, enable it. We're going to set it to add, and then going onto this, we're going to add a curves adjustment. And on the curves adjustment, we're going to bring the blacks in. So we're going to tighten down the mask quite a bit to about right here. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add an adjustment layer on top. And for this adjustment layer, we're going to add a curves adjustment, and we're going to increase the contrast quite a bit. So I'll bring down the blacks, and we're going to bring up the whites way out here towards the middle. And we want to see some of this wispy edge, but we want the mask, we're going to make a mask here, an alpha transparent, to be a lot tighter than our texture was. So you see what we've done here. Now if we stream through this, if it'll let us, you can see what's happening here. We're getting the essence of the edge of this mask. Okay, just the outline of these this cloud texture moving. What we would do is we would render out this animation as a JPEG animation. We'd go to our folder, and we would render out as a final asset. We would call this the alpha matte. You can see I've already done that. So we would render this out, cancel, as that animation. Then we would come back and we would turn off our adjustment layer on top here. We would turn off the vortex mask. And then underneath we would render out this animation as a solid animation. We would render this one out as texture. So if I come up here to our final assets folder, I've rendered it out like this, so we would see just the texture. Now we need to make one more animation here. It's actually not an animation, but one more overlay. We're going to add to this a color, duplicate the color, and on the top one we'll make it white. We will select both of these together. We'll add an effect strip, wipe. We will turn off the default fade. We'll set the fade effect to 0.5 so it's halfway through. We'll turn the angle over to 90 degrees, and then we'll turn up the blur width to a full amount, 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two strips underneath, and we will mute them, so we're just looking at the wipe effect. And then we'll take the wipe effect, set it to cross so we can see, turn on the opacity. We want our gradient here to kind of fill the space where the vortex is at, and it does pretty well. There's a little bit of an overlap. If it is too small, what you can do is you can turn on the offset or the crop settings, and you can crop the left and right, and it will stretch this out to make that blur just a little bit bigger. And then we'll render this one out, this one image, and we will save that image as, save it here, save as. In our final assets folder, we'll save it as this one, and we'll call it shadow matte. We're going to use this to affect a shadow, a left or a right shadow on our vortex later on. So we have these three images in the end. We have the alpha transparency matte, we have the texture with our contrasting clouds, shows us a little bit of parallax motion, and then we have our shadow matte. So all three of these are what we need. Okay. Once we've done that, we can go back to the 3D view. We're going to make a new scene, and we'll come over here and turn on GLSL shading mode in the new scene, turn off our render display here. We're going to add a camera, and we will align the active camera to the view from top. And what I did in my original project, set this to 1920 so it's square, I rendered out what we're going to do here as a whole other set of passes. So 3 passes for the shadow, the texture, and the alpha transparency. Because we're going to add some mesh deform. Now you don't have to do this. You could just do this process inside of your composite scene. However, what we're going to do is going to add quite a few vertices to the scene here, and if you have a slower machine, that will slow down your scene. So you may want to pre-render what we're going to do, 3 passes of this, so that you have a final asset to use. Let's move this back on Z space just a little bit. Again, we're not going to do a scene. We're not going to make a scene. We're just going to make the asset here. If you want to learn how to composite alpha transparent images, please look at some of those other tutorials I mentioned before. We're going to import as a plane our texture image from our final assets folder that we rendered out. So that's this one here that has the textures on it. And we'll scale it up so that it fills the frame. And we'll tab into edit mode real quick, and I'm going to go to tools, and we're going to subdivide this just a few times. It'll make it a little easier when we mesh deform it later. we'll go to the settings over here. And also, whenever we import, we want to make sure we import shadeless, just as we did before. We don't want to have any lights affecting this. We're going to name this texture, this material, we'll just call it texture to keep it simple. We're going to add another material slot. This new one will also be shadeless. We'll go to the texture slot, and in the texture slot we will add an image sequence. That will be from our folder we will add this one, the alpha matte image sequence. So we'll add that in. And we want to make sure that it's set to auto refresh, 200 frames starting frame 1, auto refresh. And we'll also turn on cyclic because this is a looping effect. The way we made it is that it can loop. Just because we changed that cloud texture at the very beginning, this will loop around and around and around. We can make this as long as we want. We'll go back and let's actually name this here. We'll call it alpha. On the texture one, we also want to make sure that we've enabled cyclic on the output too. And then we're going to make one more material slot. This one will also be shadeless. And for the texture, we're going to add our shadow matte. So we'll go back to our folder, and it's this one with the gradient. And this is not an animation, so we don't need to change anything about it. Now we've got these 3 materials in there that we're going to composite together using the material node editor. So we'll slide this over, open up the node editor. We'll select the first texture, the one on the top that's enabled right now, and we're going to click on this button which it says use shader nodes to render the material. It will open up this node setup here. Now we have to enable the texture. Right now it's blank, there's nothing in there. So we'll go down to texture. We'll see that output, and actually if we hit play, we'll see our texture animating here. Okay, you can see that parallax motion nice and clean in there now. And then we'll add another material input. This material input we will turn on the alpha material. So we'll enable that, and if I plug it into the color output, you'll see that this is the material that we generated. You can see that edge there, wispy edge. And then we'll add another material node, and on this one we will select the shadow. Actually, we didn't even name it, so let's name it here. Shadow. Go back up to our node set. And we'll select shadow, and that looks like this, of course. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to composite this together. We want the alpha material to go into the alpha slot. Now, actually, instantly right away, I have the shadow material in there and the alpha material going into the alpha slot. If I turn, let's make a black background here real quick. And we'll go to the display settings here. We'll turn on world background. This is actually done. You could render this out, and this is a pretty good animation. It doesn't have any deform on it, but you can kind of see what we're going to do here. This starts to look 3D already because of the shadow. We're going to take the material, and we're going to put the material into the top, and the alpha's in the bottom, and you can start to see what this looks like. Now what we want to do is we want to add the shadow to our material. So we're going to add to this a RGB curve. And on the RGB curve, we're going to bring down all of the colors quite a bit. So we're going to darken everything. And then we're going to add a color mix node. We will put the darkened output here on the top, and then we're going to put the original output on the bottom. Then we're going to take the output from our shadow, and we're going to put that into the factor, and then it will produce this kind of effect so that the left side is darker and the right side is a little bit lighter. All you have to do to change the shadow is switch these two spots here. Or you could put a invert node in here, something like that. I'm going to tighten up the shadow a little bit, so I'm going to add to this a RGB curve. We'll increase the contrast. to a satisfactory level. So we get a little bit more highlight on the right side, a little bit more shadow on the left. And maybe just to make this a little darker, we'll take down our shadow input. That's a little too far. Let's go back up. A little too much, go back up. So right about to here. Okay, so this is our final kind of output that we have going on with our shadow added. Now, the last thing that we want to do to this, and I'll show you how to change the material look a little bit here once we've done it, we need to add some mesh deform. So I'm going to go to the modifier stack for my plane. I'm going to add to it a subdivision surface modifier. I'm going to bump it up to about 3, and I'm going to set it to simple. And then we're also going to add an object to the scene. We need to add an empty because we're going to use this to drive everything. So I'll add an empty in there. You can't see it right now. Go back to our texture. We're going to add to the modifier stack for our texture a displacement modifier, a new texture. We'll go to the texture slot, and we want this to be a cloud texture. Down here under the settings, we're just going to set the size to 1, and we're going to leave everything else as a default settings. We'll come back to the node, or rather the modifier stack, and we're going to set this to X. So it's going to deform the mesh on the x-axis only. We're going to set it to object, and we're going to set the object to empty. Now we're going to set the strength to 0.2, so we'll take it way down. Then we're going to select our empty in the scene, and we're going to scale it up until it looks like it's scaled about right for what we're going to try to do. Now you see as I move this empty through the scene, it sort of animates our texture. What we're going to do is turn off our render things here so we can see what's going on. We're going to go in here, we're going to set some keyframes for our empty. So let's move it down a little bit. I'm going to input a location, and I'm going to go 20 frames out. I'm going to move it up a little bit. This is about a second worth of time, a little bit shy of that. I'm going to move it back on Z space just a little bit. I'm going to input another location, and then we're going to go to the graph editor that we had open down here. If you remember, we had this menu bar open. I'm going to hit channel, and on the graph editor channel I'm going to go to extrapolation mode, and I'm going to click on linear extrapolation. Now what this does is it puts this on an infinite line using these two keyframes. Okay, so if we go back to the viewport and turn on our render settings here, and I hit play, you'll see that this is mesh deformed based on the movement of our empty, and this really starts to look 3D. All right. Now let's add a little bit more displacement here. We'll go back to our texture, and we'll add another modifier in the modifier stack. We'll add another displacement modifier, and we're going to open up the same texture. Check texture 3, this cloud texture we had for the other one. We're going to set the direction for Y, and do the same thing. We'll set object, and we'll select the empty, and we'll set the strength to 0.1. And then we'll take our camera, we'll just move in on the Z-axis so we kind of fill out the frame with our deformations. And now if we hit play, you can see how this all goes together. And this is pretty much it. What you can do now is you can just use this in your scene. It is alpha transparent, so if you put it in the right place in your scene, you can render it out. Or you can render this one more time, your 3 outputs. So the quick and easy way to do this is to render 1, where you render out the texture straight on, and turn off the alpha, but render this out, okay, this whole animation, that looks like this. And then take the alpha output and put that into the top, and render this out. So render that whole animation. And then also, because it's deformed, it would affect the shadow. You would render out this shadow node into the output. You can see kind of how it looks there. It looks kind of deformed. And I would render that animation out as your shadow map. So if you render out these 3 new ones, depending on how long you want the animation, now you can use the asset using the same kind of compositing technique that we did here inside of a scene, but you don't have to have the mesh deform set. It can be one simple plane with 4 vertices. It doesn't take up a lot of geometric space and a lot of computing power. So anyway, that's how it works. Now let's talk about how we can make this look a lot different without having to render more textures. We can do this all within the node. So let's just set it up the way it was originally here. So we have our texture with our shadow added, and our alpha output. We can change the look of this a few different ways. This is pretty wispy kind of looking right here. It kind of looks like a thin kind of vortex. If we want to make this look a little bit more substantial, we could add over here a mix node, and then on the mix node, we'll just leave it set to 50.5 here. We'll take our shadow output and put it in the bottom. So we're mixing just the shadow smooth output onto the texture underneath. And now this looks a little bit more dense. Still has a lot of the wispiness to it, but it looks considerably more dense than it did before. So that's one trick that you can do. You could, as I indicated before, just put the shadow output in there, and that looks extremely dense. This might be more of a water spout kind of looking animation. So it's got more dense material in it. Another thing you can do, we'll go back to where we were before, and actually on that water spout kind of look, let me go back to that. One thing you can do is you can tighten up the alpha channel here. So it's very, very cloudy here on the edge. If we add to this a RGB curve to the alpha input, we could increase the contrast on the alpha channel and turn up the whites a little bit. And then doing this makes it look like it's more dense material. So now if we play this back, this looks even more like a water spout. I mean, this looks more like water droplets and haze. So that's another trick that you can use. Let's set our alpha back to where it was and our regular output. Another thing you can do is you can take this wispy texture. There we go, right spot. You can take this wispy texture here and we can invert it. So I'll add here a color RGB curve, and we'll put it on here. I'm going to take the black channel and move it all the way up. The white side, the lights, move it all the way down. So we've inverted the color, and we want this to then go through all of our other chain of nodes. So we have it now going through everything else, and you see how the color's been inverted in this way. Now this looks like more of a puffy kind of texture. So that plus perhaps this contrast curve on the alpha makes this look considerably more dense, more like puffy clouds rather than wispy clouds. We might take that and pull this trick again where we add the shadow mask over top of it. And here's an output. Okay, so lots of different ways that you can get different results and very different looks from this. The other thing that you can do is set the contrast really high so it looks really wispy, render that out, and you take that into a compositor, either the node compositor, or you can take it into the video sequence editor, and you can add a curves adjustment and make it look like fire, just like I did in my introductory videos. So you can use that kind of a technique as well. So anyway, this is how it's done. This is how you make an asset like this, very simple asset creation, something that you would swear, as you're just looking at this for the first time, is some kind of complex smoke simulation. It has all the hallmarks of a very, very complex, long rendering, high detailed, high resolution smoke simulation, when in fact it's just a big trick. We are not doing any kind of simulation at all. It is merely just very smartly composited textures and layers. So that's it. I hope you find a good use for this, and I wish you the best of luck and happy blending.